If you're watching this, chances are you're struggling with some of your orchids. And I've been growing orchids for about 10 years now, and I've made so many mistakes in growing them. And in today's video, I'm going to show you the top 5 mistakes that most orchid growers make and how to prevent them. So at the end of this video, you're going to learn how to avoid these mistakes and get your orchids to bloom and grow well. So as always, let's jump right in. Okay, so the first mistake that most orchid growers make, new orchid growers that is that they overwater their orchids for them. And you could see this in an orchid decaying, leaves turning yellow, the orchid getting wrinkly. And what happens when you overwater an orchid is that the roots die back. And ironically, because you gave too much water, the roots die off and they're not able to hydrate the rest of the plant. Sometimes you'll notice that the soil, the potting mix is very soggy, or it could even smell bad. My very first orchid, which I actually still have, I actually waterlogged the roots of my very first orchid because it was in bark. And when I watered it, water just flowed through, and I didn't realize that orchids needed a lot of air in their roots. So you'll see that they're usually in bark or sphagnum moss, and it's different than a house plant. So how do we avoid overwatering? Well, you want to make sure that your orchid is in well-draining mixes. So let me show you my Phalaenopsis here. I have this in sphagnum moss and bark. And what you want to do is you want to pour water and get it and let it drain in your sink. If you use clear pots, you'll be able to tell if your orchid needs water or doesn't need water by the way that the roots look. So as you can see here, these roots are nice and green, which means that they are completely hydrated. And I watered this yesterday, so it doesn't need any water. And I will re-water when the roots turn gray again and the pot is completely dry. You'll also notice sometimes that there's condensation in the pot. That means that there's still a lot of humidity in there. But clear pots are super handy for beginners because you could see if it needs water or not. The safest bet with orchids is to water, let it dry, and then water again. Watering it over a sink, if you grow orchids indoors, is your best bet. You water it, you saturate it, avoid the crown of the plant, and put it back into its decorative pot or back where you grow it, back to your windowsill, and that's usually fine. If you use clay pots, you could also see from the outside, if the clay pot is wet, you could kind of see the condensation on it up here. This is still wet. I watered this yesterday. Sometimes you could feel by how heavy the pot is. Clay pots are actually a little bit safer than plastic pots because they dry faster because this is very wicking. So you just want to be able to tell if you overwatered or not, and you don't want those roots sitting in stagnant water. I recommend if you're watering your orchids, don't water on a schedule. Water when those plants appear to be dry or approaching dryness. You don't want to overwater a plant to the point that the roots die off. Just remember, orchids need lots of air, and if you're constantly watering and not allowing them to at least mostly dry off, they're going to rot. So that's one of the biggest things that I've noticed with beginners that they get wrong sometimes. They just water too heavily. Okay, the next is lighting. Now this is super important. So most growers if you grow indoors, you grow either on a windowsill or under grow lights. I grow most of my plants under grow lights. If you're not giving enough light to orchids, they're not going to bloom. Sometimes you'll notice that the growths are not as big as prior growths. You'll notice that the leaves are very dark, maybe too dark for what it's supposed to be. Or on another extreme, if you give too much light, the leaves will get burned. So you have to find the right balance for orchids. So orchids need usually bright indirect light. Phalaenopsis don't need as much light as Cattleyas. They're all a little bit different. Dendrobiums, Cattleyas, and Vandas need more light than Phalaenopsis. I have multiple videos on the care for these orchids in my orchid care playlist if you're interested. However, if you don't give enough light, you'll never get your plant to bloom. But if you give too much light, it's too much. So what do we do here? So if you grow in a windowsill, you want bright indirect light. I live in New York, so if you're growing in a windowsill and say you have a south-facing exposure, that's fantastic because you're going to get very strong light. However, because it's very strong, you don't want to burn the leaves. So the best bet is to use a sheer curtain or blinds to shade that light a little bit. But that should be enough to get many orchids to bloom. If you are growing in a north-facing window and you live in the northern hemisphere, I find that it's not enough for many orchids. East-facing window is usually fine. West-facing window is very strong, intense light, usually in the afternoon, so you want to make sure to shade that. If you're growing under LED lights, you want the orchids to be somewhat close to the lights. I keep mine within a foot from the tops of the leaves. Some of my cattleyas, I have more intense lights, and that's fine. Some of my less intense lights, I move closer to the tops of the leaves and they bloom. It takes time to see if it's working. You want to give it time to see how your orchids are growing. If you're giving enough light, you'll notice that new growths match or exceed the size of older growths. You'll find that the orchid isn't dark green, but it's like a lighter green color. Not all the way yellow green, but it's not a very dark green. If you burn the leaves, you could tell that the leaves are scorched. You want to pull it back from the light source. It just takes time to know if it has enough light or not. And if you've had an orchid for a long time and it hasn't bloomed on you, a lot of times it's because it didn't get enough light. Now, if the orchid is new to your collection and say you got it from a greenhouse, it's a seedling, it takes time to adapt. It could take a year, it could take 2 years, sometimes even 3 years. This is a hobby of a lot of patience. But if you have a mature orchid, or if you've never bloomed a cattleya and you have a dozen cattleyas that are mature size and you've had them for 2 years, 3 years, and you haven't bloomed them, check out your light conditions because that's super important in getting your orchids to grow. Okay, tip number 3 is getting the right potting mix. So I have a video on this in detail right here, but this goes with the watering. So as I mentioned, orchids need lots of moisture, but they need lots of air. So that means you might be watering more often than a house plant because they're going to dry a little bit faster. But if you grow your orchids in something with very poor drainage or something that broke down too much, like bark over time breaks down, it gets compacted and then it waterlogs the roots. So you want to make sure you're using the proper medium for your orchids. I like bark and sphagnum moss. I've used leca in the past. I've used coconut husk. Love sphagnum moss a ton. Tree fern is popular. I've never used it because it's just very expensive, but there's so many materials that you can use. And what I'd say is what works for me may not work for you. I love sphagnum moss here, but my friends in Florida, they can't use sphagnum moss because it's too humid in their environment. So you really have to see what works for you. If you're in a very humid environment all the time, you might need to have more air, use coarse bark. Here, it's hot and humid in the summer only, but the winter is very kind of cold and dry. So I err on the side of more moisture retentive mixes here. This is very personal to your environment, but you don't want something that's going to stay wet a long time. So you have to tailor the materials to your environment, and the best thing you could do is trial and error. You also want to be repotting every couple of years. So if you have sphagnum moss, good quality sphagnum moss lasts usually 2 years. Sometimes you have to repot sooner, but sometimes these materials break down, as I mentioned, over time. Bark can last 3-4 years depending on the quality. So if you leave an orchid in a pot for many years, that bark will break down, as I said, and it'll turn to kind of like a dust. So you just want to stay on top of that and make sure that you're repotting your orchids. I try to every 2 years. Some I have for 3 years. Some have to be repotted annually depending on the materials. But you don't want your orchids to be sitting in very old media that's just going to compact, just break down and waterlog your roots. Okay, tip number 4 would be not fertilizing. So when I first started growing my Phalaenopsis orchid, I didn't fertilize all the time. I used the Miracle Grow fertilizer, and I would actually over-fertilize thinking it was better, and then it burned my roots and it wasn't great. I like to use MSU fertilizer. MSU fertilizer has calcium and magnesium that the big box fertilizers don't have, and it's more complete and helps the growth of your plant even better. Fertilizing is a very personal thing. Some people like to fertilize heavy once a month. Some people like to fertilize moderately, then do calcium and magnesium other days. I have a video here with more tips on fertilizing, but if you want your orchid to bloom nicely, if you want it to grow nicely as well, you want to fertilize. You want to give it some sort of nutrients. I like the weekly approach where I fertilize once a week with a week solution. I use MSU fertilizer. I used to add CalMag. I'm going to link Rick L's video down below. He has done great work with how he grows his orchids and how he fertilizes them. So I will link his channel down below. So definitely check it out. He is way more knowledgeable on this topic than I am. But I'll say, if you're not getting good growth, you're giving good light, you're giving your orchid good drainage, but something seems off, are you feeding your orchid? You don't want to feed too much, but also you want to make sure that it's getting some sort of nutrients, because remember, these orchids grow on trees normally. So they're getting nutrients in the environment. Signs that your orchid isn't getting enough nutrients: the leaves can turn yellow. You'll find that you get spots on the leaves as well. The growths aren't as strong. They're leggy. And then you can also get poor flowering or no flowers. So fertilize your orchids. It's not as crucial as light and not overwatering, but it is still an important thing. And you don't want to overdo it. You don't want to make up for not fertilizing for 6 months by giving a massive dose. That's not how it works. You don't want to burn your orchid by giving too much at once. Okay, the last tip is one that I didn't know until later on when I was growing. You have to give a temperature drop at night. So some orchids bloom when they get a temperature difference of 10 to 15 degrees between day and night. It happens naturally in my environment because I grow under lights. The lights heat up where the plants are, and when it turns off, the temperatures drop by 10%. Also in the winter or in the fall, I crack open a window so the grow space gets even a little bit cooler. But if you have an AC, central AC or something like that, and the temperatures are very steady, they're not getting a temperature drop at night. So some things that you could do is put it by a window, but you want to make sure it's not too drafty. You don't want a warm growing orchid in a 40-degree window, for example, but you have to find ways so that these orchids can get a little bit of a drop at night. Now, not all orchids require this to bloom, but Phalaenopsis, for instance, they usually flower when they get a slight temperature drop at night. So some Cattleya species also get a slight temperature drop at night. In the wild, there's seasons. In the wild, there's warmth, there's coolness at night. So when we're growing indoors, we somehow still have to mimic that in order to get good success. These are the main tips that I have that will help you grow your orchids. If there are any more tips you want to share, put them down below. There's so many little things that you could do to grow beautiful orchids. These are the main ones that stick out in my mind. There's other tips as well, such as making sure that the temperatures are suitable for your environment. So for instance, like if you're growing a Cymbidium, but they're not able to get a temperature drop, they likely won't bloom. So little things like that, you'll learn over time. But these were the main ones, and I'm confident if you have any issues with any of these 5, if you fix them, you'll be able to get blooms very soon. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye, everyone.